just wanted to tell you guys that I just loved both of your concertos so much. They were both so beautiful. I was there in person to hear Phil's. I wasn't there in person to hear Chris's, but I've listened to them both multiple times, and they're just gorgeous. And so I just wanted to, I have so many things that I want to ask you guys, but I just, what inspired the concerto? Because I noticed one was, I think, concerto for JE, right?
Yeah,
for
yeah.
Phil.
My grandma.
And Chris's was To My Younger Self. And I wondered if you guys could each talk about just what inspired that title and what you were thinking of, because both your pieces are so visual, you know, and they just brought so many images to my mind when I was listening to them. So if you could maybe Phil start and just talk a little bit about what your piece and, you know.
Sure. Well, JE stands for Jean Eisler, who was my grandmother, and she was a huge inspiration for me musically and just in my life. You know, when I was born in Prague, and at that time, Czechoslovakia was still, first of all, it was still a country, and we were behind the Iron Curtain. So she had left Prague at that point. She was English, but she had left Prague, and she kept a room in our apartment, and that room had a grand piano in there, and that grand piano was really the beginnings of how I discovered music. Mm-hmm. So whenever she would come to Prague, I say improvise together. I think I was just banging the piano, and not really like now, to be honest. And we'd tell stories, and she'd make some story up, and I'd start banging the piano away with it, and she gradually taught me to play a little bit. And so when she passed away about 3-4 years ago now, it was one of those things where, you know, my whole life I'd been listening to her stories about her life, and she led an extraordinary life. It was, you know, obviously with a lot of stories about the war and everything that happened in between, the rise of communism. It was like a real sort of potted history lesson in a way. So when it came to writing the concerto, I think for the longest time, nobody had ever said to me, write whatever you want. And when they did,
yeah, right?
I don't know what to write about. I mean, I've written for film for such a long time that I found myself really lost without a story to write about or write to. So I decided, and she had just passed away at that point. It just seemed like a fitting sort of thing to write about.
Well, Chris, I'd love to hear about your inspiration. And I just felt like there was such a childlike quality, you know, in the different sections of your piece, and which really was very buoyant to me and just so uplifting. And I just wondered, you know, I actually, when I was a kid, I wrote a note to my older self.
Nice.
and you know, like just saying, hey, you know, and I just wonder, you know, what inspired you, and was it something that you were writing to your younger self, or to you know, to family member, or what was your inspiration for the piece?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a lot of it, you know, then in the music came to playing with the aspect of time. And so like in the first movement, the Charles's part is it's a lot more rigid than it gets later. And you know, the feeling of time is very controlled and very metered. And then the second movement, it feels like time is a bit suspended, and there's a lot more emotion and free flowing. And the cadenza actually happens in the second movement. And this whole thing, I also, because of how much I've been just loving learning about storytelling and narrative in film music, this whole thing I've also mapped against the hero's journey. So Charles almost functions as like the hero in this story of, like, you know, the realization of how to get through this trying time in life. And so I was super mathematical and like probably didn't end up being helpful at all, but I tried to like actually time it out as though like there are certain points where we're breaking into the second act, and now this is the midpoint. The cadenza actually happens at the midpoint in the whole piece, and then breaking into the third act. And so by the third movement, the solo part feels like it's no longer restricted by the feeling of time, and it's kind of free flowing and playing over bar lines and doing all these things that feel like, even though it's that last movement is pretty fiery, and I still can't believe Charles played it. But it is supposed to be that feeling of like, confidence and excitement amidst this chaos that's still there, but now being able to have control of self amidst the chaos.
Wow, amazing! It's beautiful. That came through.
That's cool. That's good to hear.
Well, I want to ask Charles and Chris and Phil too, something about the collaboration process, because I know, as a pianist, and Phil, I know you're multi-instrumentalist too, but I know your grandmother played violin. I don't know if you do, but I know it's so different, to write something for another instrument that feels right on your instrument, but you have no idea if that other person is going to be able to play it. And I wondered, from Charles's point of view, how much did you feel, the collaboration that you and Chris did together? Did you work out the cadenzas? And Tara wanted me to make sure to explain, because a lot of people may not know, a cadenza is a very soloistic part that the violinist plays that kind of gets free and sometimes feels improvised. And I always wonder, is it improvised, or is part of it improvised, or is it all written out? And, what kind of collaborative spirit with all of you guys how did that work with Phil and Sarah and with Charles and Chris? I'd love to hear about that.
The learning another kind of language within a composer's writing, and that for Chris is some jazz phrasings that are different on piano than violin. So I remember in the cadenza, there's a section that Chris wrote that it just goes between, it just kind of flows between different keys. It just modulates, and it's awesome. It's really great. But I was having trouble. I was like, how do I make this sound not violinistic, and we went back and forth on that. And he actually played on the piano the way he felt it. And it's a great learning process to try to mimic that, but also keep your own voice with your instrument. So, and I think it turned out pretty good, that section. So I'm pretty happy about that. So it was a great process.
Well, Chris, what was your collaboration process with the orchestra and with Carlos and with the whole process of rehearsals then?
We had, I think, Charles, we had 3 rehearsals with
with dress, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think I knew that I could trust Charles and Carlos and the way that they were going to. I think once we had that first rehearsal and the first time we played through, and Charles and Carlos weren't freaking out, I think that I decided to internalize and hide how much I was freaking out on the inside.
Carlos is very calming, isn't he?
What's that?
Carlos is very calming, isn't he? Like,
yeah.
we did the first one, I was going, oh God, I've written a nightmare. And he went, it's gonna be fine.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and it's so incredible. Just as I knew immediately that I needed to, as composers, we sometimes have another conductor that's conducting our sessions, and yet we still feel like we can step in and say like, hey, actually, second violins come out a little bit more here, and
Right.
having a bit more of a say in how the rehearsal is run, essentially. And I think with this, I immediately was like, this is not my space of forte, and let me just kind of back up and let the professionals handle this, essentially.
I wanted to ask you guys if you felt at all constrained by the specific rules or perceived rules of writing a concerto, or did you just kind of throw that out? I mean, most concertos are 3 movements, obviously. But was there anything, I know, Phil, you said that you did some research. I assume that you had mentioned that you hadn't written a violin concerto before, and Chris either. So, I mean, did you feel like you had to learn all the rules and then feel completely free in them, or what did it restrict you in any way, or did you just take it into consideration and then just let your voice be heard?
I think so to answer your question, yes, there was a lot of studying, and there was a lot of studying the form as well as which pieces really spoke to me and which ones I really fell in love with. And really, I think if I hadn't thrown those rules out the window at some point, I would have never written anything. I think in some senses it was great to be constrained, actually, at least a little bit, because it was already, you can write whatever you want. Then thank God it was at least, but it has to be a violin concerto. Otherwise, I'd have been running around with sousaphones and vacuum cleaners. And
yeah.
At some point, I had to just kind of go. I just had to follow whatever the voice in my head is saying. And I know for that reason, and because it was the first piece for the stage that I'd written, I think, honestly, it's a little schizophrenic as a piece, stylistically. It was a lot more schizophrenic before I down. I remember the first time I did put the mock-ups into and just the piano, and I sat there. It's amazing when you play something back with somebody else sitting in the room. And, we're very used to that as film composers, and it never becomes less terrifying, at least for me. I don't know about Chris. Every time I play somebody my music for the first time, I'm just like, oh, kill me. And I remember playing it back with my assistant at the time, who's a Berkeley grad, a piano student. And so I'm always, super self-conscious about what somebody else thinks of it. And I played it end to end, and then I just looked at him. I went, "It's a mess, isn't it?" And he went, I went, "Yep, that's all I need to know." It's just stylistically, it was all over the place. It was minimal in one place and romantic in another, and it still is to a certain degree. But it became more. I think I completely rewrote the third movement after that.
Well, Chris, did you also feel like you felt freedom within the form, or did you feel constrained, or were you,
Yeah, I felt really free. I think one of the first things I did was reach out to my composition teacher at Juilliard and ask, basically say, I'm writing a violin concerto and I have no idea what I'm doing. What do I do? And his response.
That was Briggs, right?
Briggs? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the thing that I loved about him is he responded to that email with like a 6-page PDF explaining what I should be doing. He even used a couple of pieces as an example and like pointed out bar numbers that I should look at. And I think it reminded me of I remember when I was a freshman in high school, I went to an arts high school, and that's like when I first really started studying jazz on a very serious level. And my freshman year in high school, playing a simple standard, like a song called There Would Never Be Another You. It's a very simple jazz standard, but I'll never forget the feeling of playing through that song. And I knew that every single chord I needed to play in my left hand, because if I didn't, I would be lost forever. And it took, that first year or so to realize that, oh, this whole section is the A section, and that section repeats. So I don't need to remember this, these 16 bars and 16 different chords. I can remember this whole form. And then it unlocks something, because then it's like, oh, I can improvise over this whole section, thinking of it as one way, as opposed to, it just unlocks something listening to jazz and understanding when I'm listening to Miles Davis live at the Plug Nickel. If they're playing Stella by Starlight, if I know that song really well enough that I can hear where they are in the form, no matter how out they get and no matter how abstract everything becomes. And I had a similar experience with this studying process, where I took about 10 concerti that I was like taking the scores and like marking the themes and then marking the secondary themes and then looking at when those things, like marking the different sections and all that kind of stuff. And I just had this aha moment where I was like, wait, like this is what it is. There's a formula to this whole thing. Like it's not random. and that feeling was so incredible. I mean, the thing that my teacher said that I really appreciated, Briggs, at the end of that letter is he said that, you know, never forget that Ravel, I think it was Ravel, wrote a note to somebody saying that I'm almost finished with my concerto. I have the structure now. I just have to fill in the themes. And he basically was like, build your roadmap first. He gave me this whole thing where I was like, okay, I'm going to write these themes. Now I have these themes, which give me a bunch of information to be able to pull from and like create other motivic material and all that kind of stuff. Now let me figure out a very clear harmonic roadmap of where I want to go section by section, not even just like, you know, measure by measure, but I know that the A section I want to be in this key, and the next section I want to be in this key, the development in this key, the recapitulation in this key. And so breaking it down that way, for me, I always feel like the thing I love about jazz is that even though from the outside, it feels like it's all random, the thing is that most of the time, and especially the musicians that I love and the way that I approach jazz, it's actually people playing within the confines of a box. Like they're very aware of the structure, they're very aware of what's happening, but they're expressing themselves freely. And it then allowed me to push myself to figure out how to play within that structure, how to play within that form and not feel confined by it.
Did you have a feeling when you were working with the orchestra that you were working with a group of young people? I mean, or did it feel like you were working with a professional orchestra? Because they're pretty much, you know, pretty amazing orchestra. Did you feel like you were among your peers, or did you feel like you were among many students that were, you know, just getting ready to embark on their professional career? Did you, you know, was there any feelings about the way they interpreted it that you would have thought another orchestra might have done it a different way? Or were you happy with how they played it and interpreted it? And
for me, it was sort of the best of both worlds, actually, because I certainly never felt like these are students and I've got something to show these guys, because they could have shown me a billion things I would have had no idea about. But what was great about it was they had that enthusiasm of people that are just embarking on that journey and they're learning a new piece of music. And several of them came up to me afterwards and were really complimentary about certain things, and were, you know, and that actually gave me, because I was probably more terrified than they were. So, you know, they actually gave me a bit of that courage. And they play like professionals. I mean, they play to an amazingly high standard, but they lack a bit of that jadedness that comes with a tenured orchestra that's been around for years and years and years and decades, and, you know, a new composer or a new conductor turns up and you get met with a lot of eye rolls, like, oh god, narrator, great. They were just like, oh cool, you know, they sunk their teeth into it, and it was beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, these kids, they're sorry, not I mean, they're young professionals that are, right, like you said, they lack that jadedness, and it's exciting for them. It's really exciting for, I'm guessing, the composers and also as a soloist to work with these kids, because, you know, they're putting this piece to life just as much as we are, you know, and they're giving it a voice, and they're excited to do so. They're not waiting to play the standard. They're breathing, and they want to premiere this. They want to put this thing to life. So that's what I think we felt during our whole time there. At least I felt this, that these amazing young musicians were breathing life into that piece. And it was magical. Yeah.
Yeah.
Carlos certainly helped, you know.